Please welcome former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Ambassador Paula J. Dobriansky, and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd.
Good morning, everyone. Well, now we're going to take a really sharp look at China. And we're very lucky indeed here today to have former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and former Foreign Minister of Australia, and also a renowned China expert, fluent in Mandarin Chinese, to really shed light on where China is headed. Now, the topic, as you know, is focused on the economic growth of China and also how it balances it with its environmental stewardship. But first, let's step back and let's take a strategic view of China. The first question to you, Prime Minister, is let's take a look at really where is China headed? What are its core goals and objectives? And you know, you've made the statement that actually we should be looking at for the first half of the 21st century, really how China is exercising its power, what does it mean, and in particular, how we should be responding to it. So let's take that first.
Well, thanks very much, Ambassador. And by the way, if I go beyond 60 seconds in any answer, you can kick me under the table or in front of the table as may be necessary. Really important to look at how China views the world. A lot of us project onto China in terms of, Felipe, how are you? My friend, former President of Mexico, Felipe Calderon. It's really important
to... Senior fellow at Harvard University.
That's right, we're a Harvard gang down here today. It's important to see reality as seen from the Chinese prism of reality, whether you agree with it or not. And part of the beginning of wisdom is to understand how our friends in Beijing view the world. So let me give you 5 or 6 quick points about their order of priorities as they see the world over the next 10 years. Number 1, stay in power. You might find that unremarkable as a political ambition, but keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power is for them the fundamental objective. Number 2 is to maintain national unity, and you might think that's very straightforward for everybody, but when you look at China's own domestic challenges in Xinjiang and Tibet and the unresolved question in their mind about Taiwan, this is a fundamental challenge which absorbs a huge amount of their internal attention. Number 3, how do you grow the economy sufficiently in order to provide rising living standards still for those who have currently just made it into the lower realms of the Chinese definition of the middle class, as well as lifting the remaining 150 million people out of poverty within the country? And that is a massive economic growth challenge. Number 4, how do you do that without environmentally destroying the country entirely? In terms of air pollution, in terms of land degradation, in terms of water pollution, given water scarcity in the country, and finally, of course, climate change. And then on top of that, number 5 would be how do you preserve sufficient stability in the region and globally to accommodate objectives 1, 2, 3, and 4 above, while not standing back from your core national interests and your sense of national dignitas. So if we're sitting today, the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and there's only 7 of them, so we'd fit neatly onto this stage, those are the 5 core objectives. If I've omitted one, and it's the flip side of the sustainability equation, it's long-term energy security. But that would be the Chinese top of the pops.
Does China pose a threat? There have been some experts looking at the region and have been very concerned about China's enhanced military capability and what it means for the region and maybe for broader global ambitions.
Well, the Chinese strategy hinges so much on the growth of the economy. The Chinese growth from an economy which, when they began the reform process 35 years ago, which was an economy the same size as Australia's, to now being one which is on the verge of overtaking the United States in terms of gross domestic product, is a phenomenal transition. I think what we need to focus on, given that George III has already come in for a bad rap this morning, is that when China does become the largest economy in the world, and the OECD, the IMF and the World Bank project that to occur any time between the end of this year and 2024, depending on whether you use PPP or market exchange rate measures, It will be the first time that the world has had as its largest economy a non-democratic, non-Western, non-English-speaking state. Now, that will have a profound influence on the way in which the world does business, whether we like it or not. On the military side, they are obviously growing their military capabilities for a range of strategic scenarios that they're dealing with, including with Japan, the South China Sea, future contingencies on Taiwan. But the bottom line is their overwhelming preoccupation at this stage is through the tool of the economy.
Right. Let me, by the way, encourage the audience. Please use those pads and submit questions. I'm going to continue with some questions, but we want this to be interactive. So China's a key topic, and we'd really like to hear from you. Let me go to a third, and the third is, Xi Jinping has done some interesting things in these last months. First, we witnessed his meeting with Vladimir Putin and the signing of a gas agreement that had been stalled for years, as I understand it. This is truly a significant development, not only from the standpoint of Russia and its architecture and what it's looking at, but especially for China and in terms of its own energy needs. But secondly, Xi Jinping had a 3-day official visit to India and meetings with the new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Let's put these things in context. What does this connote?
Well, Xi Jinping, President Putin, Russia, plus the future of India in that longer-term China equation. The first thing I'll just say, Ambassador, about Xi Jinping himself is that what we in the collective West need to get used to, and I've met President Xi many times, both before he was president, and I've had discussions with him since then. He is the single most powerful Chinese leader that this country has seen since Deng Xiaoping. People talk about collective leadership in China. They talk about the Chinese president or general secretary of the Communist Party as being primus inter pares, first among equals. This guy is a lot more primus than he is inter pares, okay? And everyone in the Chinese leadership knows it. So I say that whether you're business people here this morning, you're dealing with broader economic questions or political and security questions, understand that what this individual thinks and what his worldview is a very large part of the equation. Going on to the Russia point, by the way, Xi Jinping will be in power, absent any external intervention, which is unanticipated, for exactly the same term as we are likely to see President Putin. So President Putin, President Xi Jinping are likely to be in office, according to the current prediction of their terms, through to 2023, 2024. Now that is important for our friends in America to understand as well. On the Putin relationship, one of the things Xi Jinping admires about Vladimir Putin is the fact he stands up for nationalist values against Western values. Again, I'm just describing a reality. This is the way in which the Chinese observe this and describe it. Secondly, the Chinese support Vladimir Putin or Foreign Minister Lavrov's definition of multipolarity in the global system. That's code language for less US power, by the way. But the third thing is, from a Chinese perspective, is that Russian oil and gas are useful, not decisive, but useful in the Chinese total long-term energy equation. One or two quick figures. If you were to look at China's current external energy dependency at present against its primary energy sources, which is coal, oil and gas in that order, coal being the massive one, oil running at about 18% of total energy supply, and gas currently at something around about 4 or 5. Coal will come down to about where it is now in the high 60s to about 52% of total Chinese energy supply. Oil will go up from about 16 or 18% to something closer to 20%, maybe 22%. The big growth factor will be gas. But again, modest in the overall spectrum, up from about 4% of total energy supply now to about 14%. And their total external energies dependency will rise from about 15%, where it is now, to about 20% by the time you get to the mid-2020s. So, If you're sitting in China and looking at the world from Xi Jinping's perspective, he will say, how do I diversify my sources of external supply of these two critical energy commodities? I will use Russia to the greatest extent I can, because the Chinese are deeply concerned strategically about the rolling instability in the Gulf, what happens in the future about the Straits of Hormuz, but if there was any general conflict in the Pacific, what happens with the Straits of Malacca as well. Finally, on India, the India-China relationship has been problematic for most of its history, with the single exception of that period following Nehru and Mao and Zhou Enlai in the late 40s through to the mid-50s. But basically, historically, a problematic relationship, and recently one as well. And essentially not to do with the question of democratic values and non-democratic values, but deep civilizational anxiety about one another, reflected at a political level, and of course, China's only major unresolved land boundary remaining with India. And that informs so much of the consciousness. From Xi Jinping's perspective, he will have noted that Prime Minister Modi is very strong on Japan. He likes Japan, he's been to Japan a lot. There's already been bilaterals in both directions. And therefore, he, I believe, will be looking to Japan for much of the future of his economic program, not excluding an expanded economic relationship with China. And he, like many of us, will be hoping the Japanese economy, under Prime Minister Abe's three arrows reform strategy, finally kicks in. But at present, the data is looking bad in Japan.
Now, you've really given a good backdrop and political foundation and strategic overview of where China is. But let's go to this question about China's desire for economic growth. And I know you have speculated that China is going to overtake the United States. At the same time, it does have the challenge of dealing with the environment and environmental stewardship. We've witnessed demonstrations in rural areas. China now has the largest greenhouse gas emissions globally. Shed light on how they're balancing, the challenge of economic growth with the need for undertaking prudent environmental actions.
Well, I was Prime Minister of Australia. When I started, my hair was brown and then it became white. If I was President of China, it would go from white to falling out. For the simple reason is, if you put in a list their domestic challenges, these are massive for any country or political system to deal with, leaving aside questions of scale. But on the core nexus of economic growth / energy security, and the flip side, which is environmental sustainability, this is so much at the core of the current leadership's priorities. On the economy first, they intelligently have recognised that their existing growth model, which has been in operation at one level for 35 years, probably at a more substantive level for the last 30, has reached its culmination point. The growth strategy up until now, labour-intensive, manufactures for export, a classical economic model using net exports to power growth in the economy and the transformation to middle-income status. The problem is wage levels have increased. Net exports is contributing less over time because global markets are contracting as well. Am I getting kicked off the stage already? That's not fair. Oh, good.
We have some questions. So,
I thought that was like the guy who comes into those shows with a big hook, pulls you off.
No. I know you were worried about the time and being pithy, but no, you're doing that's not the hook.
So the old growth model has been there and has worked phenomenally well, but with a massive environmental cost. So what's the new growth model? The document I would commend everyone's attention to is ominously called The Decision. In Chinese, it's 决定, of the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, which was adopted 12 months ago. It is a far-reaching new economic reform document. It is called the New Economic Model. And it is revolutionary in itself. It's the centrality of price mechanisms formally recognised. It is also, in part of its rationale, bringing in environmental sustainability into the measurement of performances of mayors and provincial governors. And at a different level, what it's saying that for growth to power into the future and not catch China in what's called the middle income trap, but continue to grow the economy over time, and bring the remaining people out of poverty, it'll be driven by domestic consumption, driven by the services sector, and driven by the massive urbanisation program which is now underway. And for the first time in 5,000 years, as of 2 years ago, there are more Chinese living in cities than are living in the countryside. That's what they're trying to do, and the game of catch-up football, maybe that's an Australian term, I'm not quite sure whether you use that with American football, basically you're a long way behind and you've got to catch up, is on a raft of increasingly draconian measures on air quality control, on climate change, and on water quality, and on land degradation. And the guy who's in charge of this is number 7 in the Standing Committee, a guy called Zhang Gaoli, who I've known for some time. He's been most recently the party secretary in Tianjin in eastern China. Talk about colour and changing colour of hair. This guy has gone from, you know, reasonably jet black hair to significant grey in 12 months. That's his job, environmental sustainability, given the challenges they face.
I have one more question, and then we're going to go to 2 questions submitted by the audience. But we're here at Concordia. Concordia has put together a groundbreaking index on public-private partnerships, the P3 initiative, which we've heard a lot about and we know about. How does this fit in, or does it, in the context of China and with its economic growth, and with what it's also striving to do environmentally, the investments that it's making in technology to become more environmentally sound in its approach? Does P3 fit in with China? Is there some kind of nexus there?
Yeah, it's what I'd describe as the P2 nexus. There's lots of public, there's a fair bit of private, but there's very little NGO activity, and let's just be blunt about that. But if I was looking at it more broadly in terms of American participation or global participation in where China is going longer term, I think I'd put it in these terms. If we started with the environment, moved through to the economy, and just a word on security questions, actually. On the economy, so on the environment, the single area where I see most current advance in the US-China bilateral relationship, frankly, is on climate change collaboration. The 180-degree sea change in Chinese attitudes to climate change, which I've seen in the last 3 years, is mind-boggling. Having dealt with the Chinese over many years, having been at the Copenhagen Summit on climate change in 2009 and seeing China's intransigence then on anything approaching global action, compared with China now, where they realise that unless this is acted on globally, it actually means a huge amount for them nationally and could strangle their future economic ambitions and political ambitions for themselves. This has become a huge area of policy priority. So from an American perspective, anything to do with environmental sustainability, clean green energy sources, carbon capture and storage, and go through the whole list, water quality standards, etc. There are open markets now in each of China's major cities and provinces on the part of mayors and provincial governors wanting to really rapidly increase their personal political rating by the central leadership by acting in these areas. So I see a great opportunity for private environmental firms or energy firms who are active in this sector. I think the second one I'd mention is currently in progress. The Bilateral Investment Treaty and your extensive experience of trade negotiations, Ambassador, you are completely familiar with this terrain, which has currently not reached conclusion between the United States and China, otherwise called the BIT, the B-I-T. If you can manage to bring that one off, I think the energy that will unleash in the China-US relationship will be phenomenal. Trade gets you so far in bringing countries together. Investment flows of an order of magnitude take you much, much further. And I look at the bilateral investment opportunities in this country and in China as the world's largest and second largest economies as being of a very large order indeed. And that's currently high on the near resolution list, both in Beijing and Washington, leaving aside questions of the Senate and leaving aside questions of how complete the Chinese will want the deal to be. I'll leave it at those 2 points rather than go on to the security question.
Let me, because we have limited time before our session concludes, but let me go to this question first and let's get both of them in. How will the middle class develop during the next stage of growth?
Not as fast as the middle class want. I think Chinese folks are just like us. They want a better quality of life for themselves and their kids. There's a great sort of, mythology that Chinese folks are really much different to the rest of us. They're not. They want something good for their families, they want something great for their kids and something better for their grandkids. And so, the aspiration curve from what used to be in the days of post-revolutionary China, which is called the three circles. One was a wristwatch, which was round, and the second was a bicycle with two wheels, that was another round, and the third one you really dreamt of one day was to be able to have a washing machine, which was round as well. And so China's kind of got beyond that, and it's been phenomenal to see. And so their aspirations are for decent material living standards. I think the challenge which those in the lower middle class are now facing in China is twofold. One is there is a genuine equity gap between cities and countryside and between coastal China and Western China. The second they face is the problem of institutional corruption within the country, which is massive. And hence why Xi Jinping, for a range of reasons, has launched the biggest anti-corruption campaign I've ever seen in my analysis of China, going back now 35 years. How it turns out, I cannot predict, but what I do know for a fact, it's on. And if you are in Beijing at present, you will find many Chinese officials that you deal with who are deeply anxious about what this means for their institution, their ministry, their department. And you may find them very cautious in the period ahead on decision-making as well.
Prime Minister, I'm just going to take 30 more seconds. Our time has run out, but we want to get the other audience question in. Should U.S. companies who have stayed out of China because of censorship and human rights rethink how they view the country?
Let's be very blunt about this. We Australians tend to call a spade a shovel, so let me just continue that, that noble tradition. China is not about to become a democracy anytime soon. Anyone who believes that, I think, is drinking something very strong, and I'd like several bottles of it. That's just a bottom line reality. Number two, stated as a priority from the Chinese leadership, remember objective number one, stay in power. And Xi Jinping, you might find counterintuitively, while prosecuting a range of very deeply pro-market economic reforms, is absolutely determined to retain the centrality of the Chinese Communist Party in power. Now, those of us who have looked at international relations history and political history and the rest understand that, well, hang on, you're throwing open the economy to market forces, not central planning. That's going to generate a whole new sort of locus of power within a given economy as decisions are taken locally and by firms in pursuit of capital and resource allocation and doing their own things and information flow. At the same time, running a monolithic party of 86 million members, which retains full political control. How that game plays out in the fullness of time in Chinese political history, I do not know, but it's important that everyone in this room is clear that whatever social forces are unleashed through the economic marketization project on the one hand and China's globalization on the other, it is up against an equal and opposite set of forces in terms of the desire and the capacity of the Chinese state through the Communist Party to remain in control. I think one of our previous speakers referred to, I think it was our friend from Georgia, to a concept of sovereign capitalism. I think that was his, or sovereign democracy. Sovereign democracy. I think the best way to look at the Chinese model for the future is one of state capitalism. But here is the challenge for the good old US of A. As we reflect upon America's domestic circumstances, and those who are friends and allies of this country actually want America deeply to succeed. So whatever difficulties you are going through domestically in terms of economic recovery, economic adjustment, the ongoing gridlock in the Congress and the massive debates on political campaign finance and redistricting and everything else that I've observed in the last 6 months that I've actually lived in this country, up in Boston at Harvard. Understand that our Chinese friends are actually evolving an alternative narrative for the world as well, and it's a state capitalist narrative. And it is vastly different to the one which Frank Fukuyama predicted would constitute the end of history. It's a different model. And therefore, those of us who are familiar with and have a deep affection for this country, I suppose what I would say as someone who's been in and out of America now for the last 20 or 30 years is, guys, we really do want you all to lift your game. And that's said with deep friendship and affection. And that's as much to the whole question of America's political class as it is to the rest of the American enterprise as well.
Prime Minister, thank you so much. Concordia was privileged indeed to have you this morning.